This is a large format playmat. It's made out of a rubberized foam material. It's full color, it's roadway scenes with houses and trees. And it comes with two little wheelie vehicles that the kids can drive around on the mat. And it's based on cartoon characters that people are very, very familiar with and children love. So it's really a top seller.
Jane has a dream job. She makes toys. The foam mat with the little wheelie things has been in demand for 15 years, a pillar of the business, she says. It's so popular that big box stores in the U.S. several months ago placed large orders. Her company had already produced 65% of them. Then, Donald Trump.
Do you mean Donnie Two Dolls, the guy who thinks the kids should only have $2 under their tree instead of 30?
Jane's Canadian toy company sells to American stores, but because the goods were manufactured in China back in April, they got slapped with the 145% China tariff then in place.
They're now sitting in cargo containers at the ports of China, and our accounts have all placed these orders on hold or canceled them. So we have several $1 million of just this particular product that's now sitting in containers with no home.
The Canadian economy itself is a bit like Jane's toy mats. Stuck, on hold, or maybe canceled, with no clear future, no definite point of arrival.
How much is this going to hurt? I mean, for us, it could be the end of the line.
Welcome to Gloves Off, a podcast about the threat to Canada's sovereignty and what we can do about it.
And we have a fight!
I'm Stephen Marche. In this episode, we're going to look at the war we're already engaged in, the economic war, the tariff war with the United States. How can we fight against an economy that's 10 times our size? What would that even look like? Canada finds itself in an unprecedented situation. It requires unprecedented ideas, unprecedented solutions. No less an authority than the Wall Street Journal, not exactly a left-wing rag, has called Trump's imposition of tariffs the dumbest trade war in history. The sheer volume of the stupidity can be hard to keep up with. The tariffs were supposed to start on day one of the Trump administration. Then they were moved, then delayed, then reimposed, then delayed again, then announced again on April 2nd, so-called Liberation Day, the day Trump held up his infamous chart which nobody could understand. Trump then imposed a 145% tariff on imports from China, effectively a blockade. Then they dropped to 30%, which sounded like relief. I don't know. The number has supposedly stabilized at 55%. Meanwhile, Canada is negotiating a deal. But as we've learned, as Britain has already learned, no deal survives just because Trump has made it. He broke off trade negotiations completely at one point, demanding that we give up the digital services tax, which we promptly did. You could see it as caving, or you could see it as a small but necessary tactical retreat. Either way, it shows just what we're up against. Whatever happens, any agreement is one tweet away from being meaningless. Honestly, by the time you're listening to this, the situation could be resolved, or it could be much worse. The most likely scenario is something so crazy nobody could predict it. So where does that leave us? The viewpoint of traditional economists, the people you hear as talking heads on Bloomberg or CNBC, is that the American economic system, combined with open markets globally, is the natural state of the world, and that what Canada needs to do is to compete with America on America's terms. This has been, it must be said, the dominant view for 80 years at least. In a sense, the Canadian people made their decision in 1988, with the John Turner-Brian Mulroney election on free trade, which the pro-free trade side won. That victory made Canada much richer, and at the same time far more integrated, some might say far more vulnerable to America. Traditional economics sees our integration with America as inevitable, and so the solution to the current crisis is basically to stay as still as possible, to ride it out. We take measures to make ourselves more competitive in the short term, i.e. cut taxes, and hope that the Americans come to their senses in the long term, which is probably what we'll end up doing. Any trade war between the United States and Canada would be highly asymmetric, and hoping for Americans to come to their senses is, at this point in history, a long shot. They didn't come to their senses after January 6th. They don't look like they're coming to their senses anytime soon. Americans aren't the coming to their senses type of people, frankly. Riding it out might seem reasonable at the macro level, but for companies like Jane's toy outfit, whether tariffs are 145% or 30%, time is money and money is time.
When your entire year is predicated on fourth quarter sales and you're getting paid in the fourth quarter, it's very hard for a company like that to ride out this kind of a scenario. We make toys. These toys are destined for shelves in September, October, November, and December. We are staring down the barrel of becoming insolvent if this does not correct in the very, very short term.
What if America doesn't go back to normal? What if the current insanity, the unpredictability, the malice is normal? What if we're just in the beginning of American collapse? How are we going to do business? What are our other options? Let's start with an idea that began on the edge of our country, on Fogo Island in Newfoundland, a place far, far from America.
I grew up in a place and at a time that I witnessed as a child the collapse of the inshore fishery that we had been a part of for 400 years. So when I was 8, my father said, when you grow up, you have to go away and you have to figure out how this money thing works, because otherwise it's going to eat everything we love.
Zita Cobb listened to her father.
I think he would think I'd figured out money, and I figured out how to make money. I think I figured out how it works, sort of. But now I think we have to figure it out again.
After many years in the tech space in America, Cobb returned to Fogo Island, where she founded Shorefast, a Canadian social enterprise. Then, in 2013, she opened the Fogo Island Inn, which was about a lot more than a boutique hotel with an excellent design. For Cobb, the Fogo Island Inn was about connecting economics to place.
And I started to realize that, places were really hurting. So when I went home, it was with the intent of figuring out how to put another leg on the economy.
How do you solve money for a place?
I start from a very first principles question, which is, well, what's the economy for exactly? I think it's for people. Then you say, well, what do these creatures called people need? Well, we're embodied creatures, we're social creatures, and we're meaning-seeking creatures. All of those things are satisfied in a place. And without place, we won't be able to hold on to intergenerational knowledge. We won't be able to, have the most fundamental relationship with geography, with place, with nature. So I think I've made the case that we need place, and we need to think about place, the place of place in the economy. And so how do you go about figuring out, how do you do that? And in a way, you kind of do what my parents' generation did in the late 60s. And it's something called asset-based community development. It's a simple process, really. You ask the questions. What do we have here in this place? What do we know? Must know something. What do we love? What do we miss? And then, of course, the most powerful question, which is, what can we do about it? On Fogo Island, you would very quickly come to the conclusion that this singular place would be really, really great at hospitality.
Right.
And not only that, hospitality, the way we welcome people and care for people,
sure,
the way we build a building, all of that's about culture.
It's legendary for it, right? I mean, yeah.
It absolutely is. And so I thought we deserve to have what is a world-class inn to practice said hospitality. But in the doing of it, we can reactivate the way we grew things in the past and add to that. All of the making, and it's a culture of making, but we don't make little wooden boats anymore because our fisheries changed, but we know how to make things out of wood. We know how to make things out of textile. All those things become our assets and knowledge that can be built into a hospitality sector, which is what we did. And out of that came a little furniture making business. And we have a couple of other little businesses, like an ice cream business that's based on the 26 kinds of edible berries on the island. So we just keep going with, I wake up every day and I can think of 10 new businesses that we could start.
I want you to do that exact process that you just outlined that you did for Fogo Island. I want you to do that for Canada.
Excellent. It's my favorite thing to think about and to do. So we have to start with, what is this place we call Canada? It's made up of, in my view, the sum of its parts. There are 4,434 incorporated communities that make up Canada. 1/3 of us live in places that are 50,000 people or less, 1/3 between 50,000 and 500,000, and 1/3 over 500,000. I think the path is not that different from what we did on Fogo Island. But you need to do it from the ground up. That's the key. And we have to develop our economy. We have to invest so that more of the investment equals development, and invest in ways that works with the assets in these places. We need to create the enabling conditions for communities to be in the economy. What we're missing, more than anything, is the collaborative musculature to work together. And we actually don't know each other in this country. We have enormous resources in energy of all kinds that requires investment. When we do that, let's take the opportunity to think about where, the power of where, and then how do we develop other local economies around that investment.
We're facing this sort of larger threat from America. Like Donald Trump is talking explicitly about softening us up economically to take us over politically. What about, like, how do we resist that? Because, like, you know, I think it is very clearly a nationalist economic policy that we need here, right?
I remember listening to Paul Lavoie many years ago, the fellow who founded Taxi. He started his talk by saying, why is it that Canada has trees and Sweden has IKEA? and I think we have had this, we've had a nice life, you know, but as the great line from the leopard, if you want things to stay the same, things have to change.
Right.
And so I just think we have to start by believing in ourselves a little bit more.
I actually kind of take hope but from the fact that we don't really have a choice about this anymore. That's not something that is a path to a real future. And I wonder if you see, like, this actually happening, you know, of just like, let's just ship our stuff to America and, take the win of that ending. Like, if you've noticed that at all.
I absolutely do. Another Canadian kind of bad dream that we have to get over, and that is that we're just going to be saved by some big companies that are going to come here. 89% of the people who work in the private sector in this country work for small and medium-sized enterprises. So if you're thinking about a resilient economy, you have to be thinking about a distributed economy, different sized organizations across different communities that are involved in different kinds of activities. I think the promise of Canada is really, first of all, we should fall in love with who we actually are. We have to knit a country from east to west and north to south. And it's got to be made up of webs of networks, of companies and communities and local governments and provincial governments. We have to get tangled up with each other in ways that we haven't been. I think we need more investment in our own country. And I think we need more of that investment to be actually development. How do you then use that opportunity to create more micro local economies around that? There's a process for how we attract money to a place, create as much stickiness as we can, bring as many entrepreneurs into it. I mean, I give you an example. This is the 4,434 communities. As best I can figure, only 500 of them have access to commercial banking.
Wow. So you can't get a loan for a small business if you're in outside of the top 500 cities in Canada? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, exactly. And what that means is, how are we supposed to develop?
Right.
You can't even get a commercial loan. So if you were a bank and you're sitting in your neighborhood in Toronto and you're adjudicating risk in Estevan or Fogo Island, it's going to look pretty risky because you don't know it.
Right.
Okay, let's talk about transportation. There is, I don't think, a snowball's chance in hell that the private sector is going to solve for regional air access in a country with so few people and so many places. And I believe trade follows tourism. Some people think that tourism follows trade. Government has a role to play in this. Communities have a role to play in this. We could actually have regional air access. That will be the beginning Faroe Islands are a perfect example of how this can be done.
Right. There's a big museum they built in the Faroe Islands, actually.
It's almost an impossible to believe economic development story. The first thing they did is they created an airline called Atlantic Airways. We could leave today and be in the Faroes by tonight. And as a result of creating the transportation infrastructure, they grew really strong aquaculture industry. I mean, they started with salmon, they're big in seaweed now, and a really flourishing tourism industry. And they've been pretty dedicated to the notion that their assets need to be locally owned or as close to the ground as possible.
Right.
You can scale that. Here's the really remarkable thing. They got it in their heads that they wanted to connect all these islands. So they wanted to put undersea tunnels.
Wow.
And people thought they were insane. So when you're going into these tunnels, which are enormously long, there's a roundabout.
Wow.
And not just any roundabout, a roundabout with an art installation in the middle. That is believing in your place and investing in a way that enables development.
Canadians have already figured out, on a granular level, the value of what Cobb is talking about here. Place matters. One of the most amazing aspects of living in Canada over the turmoil of the second Trump administration has been to see how implicitly Canadians understand their own economic interests. They started turning American products upside down on grocery shelves before the government advised them to, before anyone told them. By instinct, they knew that sovereignty was intimately tied up with trade. It was impressive, genuinely. But a Canadian nationalist economic program is the opposite of what we've been doing for 80 years. Since 1965 and the Auto Pact, each successive Canadian government, liberal and conservative, has sought deeper economic integration with a global order that has exactly zero respect for place. That integration was predicated on an assumption that seemed perfectly sensible at the time, that American values and Canadian values were fundamentally aligned, and that those values would spread throughout the world of their own accord. It seems laughable now, I know, but people really believed that democracy and open markets went hand in hand, and everybody wanted to live that way. And when they talked about it, they called it the end of history. That's what they meant by the end of history. The larger problem is that the system to which we have attached ourselves, i.e. unfettered global trade and hypercapitalism, is no longer working. And by not working, I mean something specific. It is destabilizing the societies and democracies underlying it. And of course, there's no going back. Canada cannot return to some self-sufficient status that no longer exists and probably never existed. And I think that isolationism is not in our nature. The question we face is, how do we keep the place we are while engaging with a globalized economy? How do we move forward, and with whom?
So in its basic terms, it's acknowledging that there are a group of middle countries that have the population, resources, and economic power to act as a third pole in what has become a two-pole world between the U.S. and China.
Jon Shell is the chair of Social Capital Partners, an organization that, in part, invests in social enterprises. Before that, he worked in private equity. For him, the new path forward for Canada is obvious. We align ourselves with the countries whose values we share. This goes beyond the idea of strategic trade deals.
Not so different from NATO necessarily. We'll agree to collectively protect ourselves militarily and against economic aggression, and we'll invest collectively in big projects that can push us all forward on a scientific and innovation basis. But it requires those countries saying, we are willing to take this leap of creating something new and setting ourselves apart from China and the U.S. in order to secure a future that looks different than the one we're headed towards today. It's not a trade deal.
Right.
This is a military and economic security and security of supply chain pact in which all those countries are able to do their own trade deals. It doesn't mean we don't trade with the U.S., and that's critical.
Right.
They need our stuff and we need their stuff. This is more about ensuring that we are not headed down the path where we are today, where it's very difficult to imagine America leading us to a future that we're going to really like.
How would you describe Canada's economic success or failure over the past 10 years or so?
And I wouldn't put it in the last 10 years. I'd talk more about a broader sweep than that. And what the numbers say, at least if you look at the very top line numbers, so what is our GDP, right? And what is our GDP compared to the US? Prior to 1990, when we were signing free trade deals, Canada was doing better than the US, right? Canada was growing faster than the US. And in the 40 years since we signed those trade deals, Canada has grown slower than the US. While at the same time, Australia, which is the closest country in the world to Canada, right, in every respect, population, resources, has outperformed the US since that time.
Why is that? I mean, why is our growth lagging behind Australians? I mean, I don't think of us as less innovative or less productive or less hardworking than Australians.
I think you have to look at that and say the major difference between our two countries is our financial tie to the US. We've gotten really tied to this behemoth south of us, and that was supposed to be good, right? New markets, higher growth, all of those things, and it hasn't worked out that way. Is it because they buy all of our companies before they have a chance to grow? Is it because they're monopolizing our IP? Is it because it's too easy for us to use Amazon and whatever, every other American technology company that we use, and so we don't build anything of our own? The other interesting thing about Australia is they gave up their auto sector, and it was very painful for them, but they've done that. And, their minimum wage is higher than ours. Their healthcare system is better than ours. Their education system is better than ours. The taxes are around the same. So, I think you have to look at that and say the major difference between our two countries is our financial tie to the U.S.
That's a really interesting thing. I mean, you're basically saying that Donald Trump may have done us a favor by forcing us out of this relationship in a way.
Yeah. I wanted to think through what an optimistic, different approach would look like, right? What happens if a bunch of other people get together and put an alliance together that excludes the U.S. intentionally? Part of the realization there was some of the largest countries right now that are these middle powers, right? Non-U.S., non-Chinese powers were like decimated after World War II.
Right.
Japan was defeated, Germany was defeated, England was in tatters, France was in tattered. That's just not true anymore. Mm-hmm. So a world in which the U.S. has to lead, which was true in 1945, is not true today.
But, as someone who's in the business community and, works with the private sector a lot, how... Like, it seems to me there's an emotional shift that's already happened, right?
Yeah.
We know on some level we have to untether from the United States.
Yeah.
Then there's the theoretical question of how we do that, which I would like your answer to as well.
Yeah.
Also, the practical question, like, how practical is it for us to actually untether from the United States as an economic bloc? It's so big, it consumes so much, and it's right there.
The real way to think about it is it's not replacing all American trade with something else. I think the mistake in this is to think about this as trade. I think that there's no question we will continue to trade with the U.S. The U.S. and China trade a lot. I mean, Germany bought Russian gas for a long time. Like, there are trade agreements between countries that make sense practically from a business perspective that don't require the type of military and social connection that currently exists between Canada and the U.S. And so I think if we thought about them as different things and said, we need an alliance for security, we need an alliance for protection from economic aggression that is different from a trade deal, right? That allows us to fight aggression by the two main superpowers in the world, then that creates a different type of global structure. So if you look at the 10 countries that I identified, and this is not because I think this is the right answer, but it's just really interesting, and it's Canada, Australia, UK, Japan, South Korea, Spain, Germany, France, Italy, and the Netherlands. I got them all, right? If you look at the top personal tax rate, the corporate tax rate, the healthcare system, infant mortality, life expectancy, we're the same.
They do. They truly share our values.
We're the same.
I mean, we talk about we share American values, but we don't. We really share Netherlands values.
We're not exactly the same, but there's universal coverage on healthcare.
Yep.
Lots of support for education. All of the things that we believe to be right. So there's one to say, okay, yes, we're going to be, we're going to adopt a bunch of tax policies that are the same as the U.S. We're going to reduce our corporate tax rate. We're going to reduce we're going to do all those things to encourage investment in Canada or whatever they think will happen at that stage. What happens when the U.S. reduces their corporate taxes to zero?
Right.
What do we do then? Do we reduce them to zero? And if so, how do we keep our healthcare system? They're willing to sacrifice the welfare of their poorest people in exchange for dominating the global economy.
Yeah.
Right? That's essentially what it breaks down to. And so I think stepping back and saying, what does different look like? A deal is done that creates a whole new supply chain that works for these countries. We in Canada have steel, aluminum, and cheap power. Europe needs munitions. Why aren't we figuring out a way to supply them with some kind of a deal? Like, there are things that we can imagine.
How do you imagine that working? Like, how do we get to that place?
I think it's a complicated path that isn't as obvious as NATO would have been back in 1944, 1945.
Yeah.
It's really cool, actually, to look at the kinds of ways we thought about that, and that they're actually quite similar to, I think, what you do today if we could make something work. There are complexities. 5 of the countries that I identified are part of the EU. That creates challenges for those countries in building other alliances. But I think there's a realization in all of those countries and among the people in those countries that something needs to change. And so why doesn't it just start with, like, let's have a summit that excludes America?
And that's the larger point here. The problems Canada faces are not necessarily the temporary problems of the tariffs or the trade war. Carney is already making trade deals and security arrangements with European partners. He did so at the G7 and the NATO summits. But the pivot must be more than away from America. It must be away from the idea of America. The problems we face are those of economic and social structure. We have been playing America's game, and there are several problems with playing America's game. The first is that the Americans don't want to play it anymore. Any trade deal that we make with them, like the USMCA in 2018, they can just tear up on a whim. The second is that we can't win because it's their game. They invented the International Trade Network. Not only do they hold the cards, they built the table. They determined who was going to sit at the table and who isn't. But third, and maybe most important, is that the game itself is rotten. It's decomposing. It's becoming putrid. And there's no better example of the rottenness than America itself. American capitalism used to be the essence of the aspirational. It used to be one of the wonders of the world. Now it is a warning. Their pure form of capitalism, while hugely productive, has led to a social instability, which has led to a political instability, which has led to an economic instability. The United States spends more money servicing its debt than on its military. Why would we want to be like that? Why would we want to play that game? So the question of this show, how do we not go broke? How do we survive a trade war? The answer is that we don't fight the trade war. We do what is right for us and what we want to do, which is to stay ourselves and build our country. What you love, you develop. You love your children. That's why you send them to school. Zita Cobb loves Fogo Island. That's why she built the Fogo Island Inn. The time for building Canada has arrived. Meanwhile, we move on as much as we can because we have to. Every trade network we build outside of America strengthens Canada. Every trade network we build with America weakens us. And the good news is that we are doing this already. In April, Canada's trade with America declined 6.6%, but trade with the rest of the world went up 24.8%, making up nearly the entire amount. And, in a sense, the future without America is not a choice that Canada has made. It's just a fate that we have to endure. And we're good at that. We're already living in the future, for better and mostly for worse. Living next to a highly unstable, dangerous country is new to us. There's so much about it that we don't understand. The good news is that many countries in the world have a lot of experience living next to psychotic countries. And that's why next episode, we're going to look at what we can learn from Ukraine, who has lived in the shadow of a monster its entire existence. This is Gloves Off. Let us know what you think wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Stephen Marche. Thank you for listening.
The old relationship we had with the United States is over. are always ready when someone else drops the gloves.
The true north is indeed strong and free.
Oh, Canada, 51st state. 51st state.
Jobs and free.
People of Canada like it.
Maybe our greatest state. Drops the gloves.